At the edge of the valley where the grass reaches to the waist and the sunset melts into the gold of the horizon, stood two destinies that were never meant to be together. He is a son of the land, born among the fires and the singing of the wind. His people lived here long before the white tents of the English broke the silence of the prairie. He knew how to listen to the earth, how to feel the rain before it came, and how to be silent with dignity when the tribe's last was taken from them. She is a woman born far across the sea, but raised among the tobacco plantations of her father, an austere and wealthy man who brought her here to the west, across the ocean, promising prosperity and order to the new land. He didn't believe in the legends of the Cheyenne tribe. He didn't believe in the invisible boundary between their land and his. He believed in the treaty, in the rifle, in the law he wrote himself. But love does not ask permission from borders and agreements. It comes like a summer fire, unheard, and suddenly covers everything. They had not met in houses or at balls. Their gazes first crossed in the old grove where his mother's tribe had once prayed to the tree spirits. She had gone there out of curiosity, he to remember who his people were. Both said nothing, but they remembered. The war between their families began long before they were born. In treaties, in dead buffalo, in the false smiles of traders and the tossed bottles of whiskey. Each new fence driven in at the edge of the land was like a needle in the heart of the old world. But they, young and quiet, stood on the front line, unaware that it was a front. They didn't write letters to each other. They didn't call each other by name at night. Their love was like smoke, elusive, but smelling of the burned past. He knew that kissing her would cost him his brother's blood. She knew that one encounter with him and her father would cut her out of his life, as he cuts out an unnecessary word. But they came anyway, first once, then again and again. And over the hill, people were already gathering, on each side. Not for love, for revenge, for land, for order. But every flower, before it is plucked, still has time to bloom. Chapter 1. The Seal on the Earth. Dust was rising from the road, as if something formidable was creeping toward the horizon. The horses were silent, and the men were silent too. Only the metallic creak of the boundary pegs broke the silence as the workers hammered them into the ground, as if hammering nails into the lid of a too lively coffin. That day the boundaries shifted, not on paper, in the heart. At the edge of that land stood an old oak tree, overgrown with moss like gray memories. It had witnessed everything, chants around campfires, the first steps of children, vows made to the spirits, and now they've marked out a plot of land for pasture underneath it. One of the English engineers, his glasses adjusted, was drawing a map directly on the roots, not looking at his feet. The earth doesn't scream. It waits. Two men watch from the hill, a young man in a leather vest standing as if carved out of the same earth, and an elder who put his hand on his shoulder. They were silent, not out of fear, out of understanding. Meanwhile, in the village, glasses were being raised. The girl's father had an occasion. He had finalized another deal. An official in a dusty coat shook his hand, and that handshake was a verdict. When the stranger signs, the native is gone from the face of the earth. Not immediately. First, from memory. The girl was standing by the window. She was not part of the party. She looked where there were no roads, where the sun was setting behind the grove she had known since she was a child. She'd seen him there once, and she'd never been able to stop looking that way ever since. And at night the wind began to blow. It swept across the valley, as if searching for someone who still remembered the way things used to be. It reached for every chimney, every crack in the walls, every wound in the ground. As long as there's no blood on the ground, you can stop everything. But once it touches the roots, everything that grows is bitter. In the morning, the tribal children did not go to the river. There they were already digging trenches for the fence, digging with a shovel on the face of history. One of the adults burned a wreath of grass, silently, without ritual, a sign that times had changed, and that the spirits were silent now. The young man went down to the river. He picked up a shingle from the shore branded with the mark of a migrant family, and squeezed it so tightly that his fingers turned white. He didn't yet know how she called to him in his dreams, and she didn't yet know that his dreams were already full of ashes. Nothing exploded that day. No one fired a shot. But that was the first crack, the one that causes the collapse. Chapter 2: Ashes and Rain. When smoke rises above the ground, it doesn't always mean a forest is being burned. Sometimes it's a memory being burned. On the fourth day after the survey, the air began to smell of burning. At first it seemed that it was someone burning rubbish, cleaning the field, but the cinders don't go away. It stretches from the river, where they've recently put up the English branding plates. Someone turned the posts in the night. The stakes disappeared, as if the earth itself had rejected them. In the morning they found a white feather in the grass, stuck right in the center of the circle. Elizabeth's father picked it up, threw it on the fire, and said it was a provocation. He did not know that the feather was not a challenge but a warning. When a bird's nest is taken away, it doesn't attack at first. It circles. It watches. Waits. In the tribe's camp, the elders have gathered. Among them was a young man whose eyes were quieter than the wind. His name was Ayo. His name meant wind, and it fit him as well as his skin fit his body. Ayo was born at dawn. His mother said the wind blew especially gently that day, as if it knew who it was bringing into the world. He didn't say much, but if he stood, he didn't back down. Ayo listened to the old warriors argue, some demanding patience, others demanding action. He simply stepped out of the circle as soon as someone spoke his brother's name. The brother had died long ago, in another land, in another quarrel. But his name was remembered when the smoke started. Ayo walked towards the grove. It had always been his shadow, and not just because his mother's spirits rested there. There, among the thin trees, among the grasses, he had once seen her. Her name was Elizabeth. He never said that name out loud, not even to himself, as if to call her by her real name would make her disappear like a deer in the morning mist. She appeared by the creek, just as she had that time, alone, without companions, without words. In her hands was a bundle, a handkerchief, within which lay a wooden figure. It was the toy of an Indian boy who had disappeared a few days before. She didn't just give back a toy. She got back a part of the house that was no longer there. Ayo took the bundle. He only nodded, and that was more than could be said. They stood like wood and water, close but never one. Behind them, in the village, in the house with the tall fireplace, Elizabeth's father was already gathering the men. One of the hunters had found an abandoned amulet by the ruined fence, and it was enough to ignite what had long waited for a spark. Revenge requires no proof, it needs reason. As darkness fell, the first torches came out from behind the hill. They walked without a sound. In English, military. The tribe did not expect it. Tents lit up in the darkness. Children screamed. One old man didn't make it out in time. The earth heard his cry, but could not save him. Io was too far away. Elizabeth was too powerless. When he returned at dawn and saw what was left, he didn't fall to his knees, didn't scream. He just stood like a tree and watched. And then, for the first time, it rained. The wind is silent, but the rain cries. Chapter 3. Blood under the skin. When the smoke clears, what is left behind is not only ash, but traces that cannot be erased. The morning after the fire was deceptively calm. The sun was rising above the horizon, coloring the sky with soft hues, but the land was silent. The tents of the Cheyenne tribe were charred frames, and the air was saturated with the smell of burning and loss. Io stood amidst the ashes, feeling the ash beneath his feet, mixed with the earth of his ancestors. In his hands he held a bundle, the only thing left from the past. But now his thoughts were not on Elizabeth's offering, but on his ruined home, the lives lost, and a future that seemed uncertain. The tribal elders gathered in the center of the settlement, their faces stern and full of sadness. They discussed what had happened, trying to understand the motives of the attackers and decide how to proceed. Some called for revenge, others for caution and peaceful solutions to the conflict. Io listened but did not intervene. A storm of emotions raged in his heart: anger, pain, doubt. He knew that any decision would have consequences that would change their lives forever. At this time, Elizabeth was in her house, where she was once again standing at the window, staring out into the distance at her own thoughts. She was not allowed out. A servant brought food and water without looking her in the eye. Her father spoke to her through the door. He knew she was in the grove. He did not shout. He said one thing: "You don't understand what they were. You don't know what they did to your grandfather." She didn't answer, because she knew that memory was no excuse and that hate can live longer than those who started it. Her thoughts were with Io and his people. She felt guilty for the actions of her father and his people, but she didn't know how to help. Her heart was torn between loyalty to her family and love for Io. Meanwhile, Io left the camp at night and went to the rocks behind the stream, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts. He sat down on the ground, feeling its coolness, and took out his brother's knife. He removed a feather from the hilt and hung it on a nearby branch, symbolically leaving a part of the past behind. At that moment, Io realized a choice had to be made. The path he chooses will determine not only his fate, but the fate of the entire tribe. Chapter 4. Hoarfrost on the arrows. Cold doesn't always come with the wind. Sometimes it's in the eyes, in actions, in the silence that comes after words. 2 days after the fire, frost fell on the ground. The grass was covered with a thin crust of white, as if nature itself was trying to hide the traces of what had been burned. But fire is not an enemy that can be covered by hoarfrost. It lives on in people, in their gazes and silent gestures. Io was sleepless. He got up before everyone else. He'd walked toward the hills where the young aspen trees grew. There he drew the bowstring, slowly, not like a craftsman, but like a warrior. The bow was new, the first one he'd ever made himself. Before that, he'd carried his father's weapon. Now it was his own. Revenge doesn't ask for permission. It wakes up with you and lies down when you fall asleep. The elders were silent. They saw Ao sitting by the fire with his brother's knife, sharpening arrowheads. He did not speak of revenge, but the camp knew the cup would soon overflow, and if there was blood to be spilled, it would not be the last. Elizabeth often watched from her balcony. Her father's house was tall, overlooking the plain. Down there, between the trees, hid the Cheyenne camp. She couldn't see Ao, but she sensed he was there, alive, alert, like a drawn bow. Father was getting ready to go on the road. He was angry. The land officer refused to sign another document saying the land selected for development was still in dispute. Father called it Indian shenanigans. If the law is not with us, we will write our own, was not infrequently heard from his lips. During the night, a wagon burned down in the village. Someone heard screams. One of the overseers was shot in the shoulder, not fatally, but enough to scare the others. In the morning, a detachment gathered, 5 men with rifles and reins in their hands. Their faces were covered with handkerchiefs. Among them was the steward's youngest son, a dashing and violent lad who dreamed of becoming a hero of the frontier. They were saying, "It's just a sortie." But there were more than just riders sitting in the saddle. Now they were like bullets, launched without a target but in the direction of Dot. Io had seen them before, on the hunt. He knew how they rode, how they shot, how they laughed. Now he watched from afar, and he didn't laugh. He looked up at the sky. There were crows flying, and down below, between the trees, others were hunting, those who are disturbed by the spirits. They were also watching and waiting for the moment. The young hunters of the tribe decided to act without advice. They knew that among the riders was the son of one of the officials. That was enough. And when the arrows found their target in the morning, the frost had not yet melted on them. Chapter 5. The Silence of the Bones. Sometimes the loudest thing isn't the yelling. It's the fact that no one speaks afterward. First the horses, then the shouts, then gunshots. Silence came next, ominous, signaling that another round of vengeance had begun. The manager's son did not return. His body was found in a hollow with a punctured shoulder and a severed temple. Cheyenne usually took the dead with them, but he'd been left carefully, placing the arrow nearby as a sign, not a threat. A final warning. Panic in the village. Women didn't come out of their houses. Men prepared, cleaned their weapons even if they couldn't shoot. Elizabeth's father closed the gates, posted sentries. There was no fear in his eyes, only rage. He was silent for a long time before he spoke aloud. It's a declaration of war. Meanwhile, there was no jubilation in the Cheyenne camp. The young man who had fired the arrow was the brother of the slain hunter. His name was Kuano. He did not hide his face. The elders did not argue with him. No one scolded him. But when he passed the fires, people looked away, realizing what grief was coming to them now. Ao watched from the sidelines, leaning against a tree. He was not part of the raid, but when he heard who had been brought back to the village, he did not condemn them. He quietly followed to watch the official bring his son's body back to the village to sort out his own thoughts on the matter. But he felt no victory, only weariness. As if with each death, the earth was losing something important. It was as if nothing could ever come back. What was sown was reaped. Elizabeth heard what had happened through a servant. She sat in her room barefoot, unmoving. Her hands trembled. not from fear. It was from understanding. Love doesn't die in bullets. It dies in the inability to say, "I'm here." That same night, Io went to the rock again, but not alone this time. Kuono followed him, silently, no weapons, only blood on his sleeves. They sat for a long time, not side by side, but in the same silence. Sometimes when a person passes away, their spirit still lingers among the living, and you don't know if it's your friend or your enemy. Chapter 6. Gunpowder and the Feather. Every knife actually has two blades. One blade cuts the enemy, with the other, the soul of the one who holds it. The day was dry, as if the sky did not want to wash away either blood or guilt. The streets of the village smelled of gunpowder. The old warehouse where guns and ammunition were kept had been opened. People were coming out of there with boxes in their hands, like bread. Only there was no life in those boxes. Elizabeth's father didn't say much, but every move he made was a decision. He ordered new patrols to be posted, exits to be blocked, neighboring farms to be contacted. People were gathering in the house again. Servants, hunters, surveyors. They whispered among themselves while the master drew a new line on the map. It must not pass through land, but through fear. And where there is fear, there is power. Elizabeth went down the hall. Her footsteps were barely audible, but the room was silent. Father looked up. He hadn't expected to see her. "Back to the room," he said quietly. "Today is not the time for curiosity." His voice was steady, but there was a shiver of metal in it. Elizabeth didn't answer, only looked at the map. A thin line ran through the grove, through the creek, through the place where hope had first arisen. She left without waiting for a second order. Meanwhile, Io stood at the sacred stone where the feathers of the warriors were kept. Each one for a deed, not a murder, a decision. He held his own, not yet woven into the ritual wreath. It was black with a white stripe, like the night before a storm. In his hands was not a weapon. In his hands was a choice, to remain a shadow, or to be the one to face the storm. He knew the Cheyenne could not take another blow. Not now, not without rest. And if they did, it would be over faster than it had begun. He knew another thing. Kuono would be gone again, before dawn. When Io returned to the camp, the elders were already sitting around the fire. No one spoke his name, but one of them, the oldest, pointed to the quill in his hand and said, "You haven't put it in yet, so you haven't decided who you are yet." Chapter 7. Nights that don't remember names. True love doesn't need vows. It's enough to breathe next to someone you're ready to take your last breath. This night the trees did not move. The wind was weak, too weak to chill, too quiet to dissuade. They were both walking towards each other, through their fears, through other people's inhibitions, through a darkness where every sound could be the last. Io chose to follow the creek, an old path overgrown with sedges. He did not turn around. He knew that if she wasn't there, he would still make sure. If she was there, he couldn't leave. Elizabeth walked in the dark. No lights, no shoes, no plan. Only with a memory. This is where it all began. And maybe this is where it will end. They met in silence. Not because there was nothing to say. It was because everything that was between them could not be put into words. Io stood a little higher, at the break in the rock. Elizabeth came out to him, with her hand clasped to her chest. They stopped, as if they were afraid of messing up reality. It wasn't just a meeting. It was the touching of two destinies that had tried for too long to be strangers. He walked over. He put his palm on her cheek. She closed her eyes, not out of fear, but out of a desire to stay in this moment forever. They embraced, passionately, for a long time, clutching each other, not just like lovers, like storm survivors. Hayo took her hand, her fingers trembled. Both of them, they sat down by the rock. He took the feather from his belt and placed it leisurely in her lap. He didn't ask her to take his fate. He just gave her what he had left. They sat like that until the sky began to gray. That night brought no salvation, but it gave them the right to be, just for a moment, without war, without kinship, without blood. They didn't swear eternal oaths to each other, because they knew there was no such thing as forever, but while her hand lay in his, the war was far away. Chapter 8. When the songs end. Sometimes silence comes after words, and sometimes in their place. The fourth day after the meeting in the grove, it started. First, the dog disappeared, then the hunter who had gone to the northern ravine. He was found under a tree with a torn chest and empty eyes. The camp began to move the children deeper into the camp, away from the open. The elders said it was all a sign. Ayo remained silent. He knew this was not just a sign. It was a portent. Elizabeth's father sat behind a map. He had a parchment in his hand, but he clutched it as if he were holding a gun. The servants were whispering. People from the neighboring county had arrived in the village. They were not officials. They were silent gunmen who were not called by name. That night the gates weren't just bolted. They were nailed shut with boards. When Elizabeth walked into the house, she realized she too had been locked up. Not for security. It was for control. Not being able to go out is scarier than the fear of being outside. At the Cheyenne camp, Ayo said goodbye to his friend's mother. She gave him an amulet on his belt for protection, for memory. He didn't know if it would help him, but he took it. Then he went up to the hill. He could see everything. The river, the village, and the clouds, heavy as cast iron. He waited. He could feel disaster approaching, and it came. Not the army, not the soldiers. 15 armed men in black coats. No signs, no flags. They came at night when the children were asleep and the fires were almost out. The first to fall was a young man by the creek, before they could tell him the trouble was coming. Then a woman jumped out with a pail. Then another was shot. Ayo ran toward the scene as soon as he heard unfamiliar footsteps, the rhythm of boots that never happens in the night. Then the ear-splitting gunshots. Our hero was close at hand, rushing like the wind. He sprang out of nowhere, bow in hand, aiming by instinct. The first arrow found his enemy's throat. The second found the stomach of another. He saw no faces, only silhouettes, only weapons, only targets. He screamed, not from the pain, from the power that overwhelmed him. The scream was as loud as a gunshot, stronger than a gun. The scream was a rumble of alarm, as old as blood itself. Men began to emerge from the tents, some with knives, some with clubs, some with bows. When the world falls apart, you don't wait for orders. You go where it's darkest. Ayo managed to wound another one, then another. When there were too many, he retreated to the rock, his back to the rock, blade in hand. He had nothing to defend but time. He was stalling for seconds, until backup arrived, until they did. And then the bullet, sneakily, sideways, into his ribs, deep, hard, and it knocked Ayo to the ground. Accompanying the fall was the roar of a dozen approaching Cheyenne warriors answering the young hero's call. Chapter 9. grieving for two worlds. There is a death followed by silence, and there is that after which comes understanding. By dawn it was all over. 15 came, 15 didn't leave. Some fell from arrows, others by stones, knives, screams. Some surrendered in terror. The Cheyenne repelled the attack. They did not celebrate. No one raised their weapons above their heads. They just stood in the middle of the night, full of cinders and blood and their own breath. Io sat by the rock. His back stuck to the rock. His head felt heavy. His side was burning from the wound. Blood trickled down, soaking the ground. He could feel himself disappearing. And then she came. Elizabeth is in her nightgown. Her legs are abrasions. Eyes ashy. She made her way through the chaos. In a flash, she found him as if she'd always known where to run. She rushed to him, kneeled down, stared into his face. He was alive. He was breathing. He opened his eyes, looked at her, like a sky that no longer promised rain. She pressed against him, not hard at all, softly. She lifted his arm, put her arms around his shoulders. He tried to help her lift him with his last strength, as if he were rising from his own grave. She held him, pulled, not by force. Faith called for help, and at that moment a rustle. A gunman popped out of the bushes, wounded, angry, with hatred in his eyes, on his last breath. He raised his gun a dozen paces away from them, took aim at him, as if she didn't even notice. But they stood side by side. She was holding him. The gunman fired before Cheyenne, who noticed the scene, plunged the axe into his head. The bullet entered him, and her. She didn't even flinch, just looked into his eyes, and slowly settled down beside him. Her hand still held his shoulder. Io's breathing became shallower, but he kept looking at her. Until the last moment. They died at the same moment. They died together, giving birth to one silence. In the morning there was smoke over the valley. Among the burned-out patches of earth were two bodies. They lay close together, as if they had never been apart. Elizabeth's father arrived first. No soldiers, no counselors. Alone. He came over. He looked for a long time. Then he sat down on his knees. Nearby, a little farther away, stood the chief. He didn't come any closer. He just stood there. Their eyes met. They were from different worlds, but grief is always from one. They stood in silence. There was a body between them, and in that minute there was no land, no blood, no truth between them. There was only loss. Epilogue. Tree at the turn of the... Sometimes the earth refuses to forget, but sometimes it learns to forgive. Years later, a tree grew where their ashes were scattered. Not tall, not spreading, stubborn. It was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Its roots went deep into the rock. The trunk was dark, as if soaked in ash. The leaves were pale as hoarfrost and fell not in the fall, but when someone whispered someone else's name nearby. It didn't grow on the side of the settlement, nor on the side of the camp. It sprouted exactly in between. People who passed by often remembered what had happened. Some left smooth stones under it, some left feathers. Some just sat in the shadows, silent. No prayers, no promises. It didn't become a monument to love. It was a reminder that hate only breeds more hate, and no matter how much revenge you take, the circle of vengeance always comes home. When two fathers, two chiefs, stood silent over the bodies of their children, for the first time, no one demanded justice. Because justice is not always where the truth is. Sometimes it's where silence gives birth to awareness. So ends this story, ladies and gentlemen. But it's not the end of the ones that haven't been told yet. Because while the wind sounds in the grasses, as long as the smoke wafts over the plain, as long as one is willing to listen, we'll tell you another one, and another, and another. Subscribe to the channel. Here on our side of the prairie, you'll hear more than just stories. You'll hear the heartbeat of the Wild West.